Picture this: an empire so vast it stretched across three continents, controlled the crossroads between Europe and Asia, and ruled over 30 modern nations for more than 6 centuries. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just another historical footnote, it was a superpower that shaped the world we live in today. From the spice routes of Istanbul to the battlefields of Vienna, from the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina to the coffee houses of Damascus, the Ottomans didn't just conquer, they absorbed, adapted, and transformed everything they touched. But here's the million-dollar question. How did a small nomadic tribe from the hills of Anatolia build the world's last great Islamic empire? And perhaps more intriguingly, why did an empire that survived the Black Death, the Mongol invasions, and countless European coalitions finally collapse in the 20th century? The answer lies in a fascinating paradox. The Ottomans thrived for over 600 years precisely because they were masters of adaptation. They absorbed cultures like a sponge, innovated militarily when it mattered most, and walked a tightrope between religious devotion and political pragmatism. But when the world changed faster than they could adapt, that same flexibility became their weakness. This is the complete story of the Ottoman Empire, from a warrior's dream to a sultan's nightmare. Buckle up, because we're about to explore one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Our story begins in 1299 with a man named Osman, leader of a small Turkic tribe called the Kaya. But Osman had something most tribal leaders didn't: a vision. Legend tells us that he once dreamed of a massive tree growing from his chest, its branches stretching across continents, its roots drinking from flowing rivers, and its shade protecting millions of people. Whether you believe in prophetic dreams or not, Osman certainly acted like a man with destiny on his side. While the Byzantine Empire was crumbling and other Turkish tribes were busy fighting each other, Osman was building alliances and gradually expanding his territory through a brilliant combination of conquest and diplomacy. His first major victory came in 1326 when his forces captured Bursa, a prosperous Byzantine city that would become the Ottomans' first real capital. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was a statement. The Ottomans weren't raiders or temporary conquerors, they were here to stay, to build, to rule. But the real genius of early Ottoman expansion came under Osman's grandson, Murad I. Murad understood something crucial. You can't build a lasting empire with just tribal warriors. You need professional soldiers, skilled administrators, and a system that can outlast any individual ruler. Enter one of history's most controversial and effective military innovations, the Janissary Corps. Here's how it worked. The Ottomans would recruit Christian boys from conquered territories, convert them to Islam, and train them from childhood to be elite soldiers absolutely loyal to the Sultan. These weren't just any soldiers, they were forbidden to marry, encouraged to see their fellow Janissaries as brothers, and trained in the most advanced military techniques of their time. It sounds harsh by modern standards, but here's the remarkable thing. Many of these Devshirme recruits rose to become grand viziers, generals, and some of the most powerful men in the empire. The Ottoman system offered social mobility that was virtually impossible anywhere else in the medieval world. Murad I proved the effectiveness of this system at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Even though he was assassinated during the battle by a Serbian knight, his disciplined Janissaries secured victory and Ottoman control over the Balkans. Murad's death became a martyr's tale that inspired Ottoman warriors for generations. But every empire faces its breaking point, and for the Ottomans, it came in 1402 at the Battle of Ankara. Timur, you might know him as Tamerlane, crushed Sultan Bayezid I so completely that Bayezid died in captivity, reportedly in an iron cage. What followed was the Interregnum, an 11-year civil war between Bayezid's sons that nearly ended the Ottoman Empire before it really began. Brothers fought brothers, provinces declared independence, and European powers circled like vultures, certain that the Ottoman threat was finally over. They were wrong. Mehmed I emerged victorious from this chaos, but more importantly, the crisis taught the Ottomans a crucial lesson. Adaptability wasn't just useful, it was essential for survival. The empire that emerged from the Interregnum was more centralized, more disciplined, and more determined than ever. The early Ottomans succeeded because they understood something their enemies didn't. True strength comes not from rigid traditions, but from the ability to learn, adapt, and absorb the best of what you encounter. This flexibility would carry them to heights no one could have imagined. By 1451, the Ottomans were no longer a frontier tribe, They were a rising power, but one prize remained tantalizingly out of reach: Constantinople, the legendary city that had stood as the capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years. Enter Mehmed II, a 19-year-old sultan with an obsession. From the moment he took the throne, Mehmed had one goal: to conquer the city that Napoleon would later call the capital of the world. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 wasn't just a military campaign, it was an engineering marvel. Mehmed commissioned the largest cannons ever built, including one monster that required 60 oxen to move and could fire 600-pound stone balls. When the massive chain blocking the Golden Horn proved unbreachable, Mehmed did something unprecedented. He had his ships dragged overland, bypassing the chain entirely. But here's what makes Mehmed truly remarkable. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a visionary. After capturing Constantinople, he didn't destroy it. Instead, he transformed it. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque, but its Christian mosaics were preserved under plaster rather than destroyed. Jews expelled from Spain were welcomed with open arms. The city was repopulated with Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the empire. Mehmed understood that the strength of his empire lay not in homogeneity, but in diversity. He was creating something new, an Islamic empire that could incorporate and benefit from the talents of all its subjects. If Mehmed was the architect of Ottoman power in Europe, his great-grandson Selim I was the Conqueror who made the Ottomans a truly global empire. In just 8 years, Selim doubled the size of the empire and fundamentally changed its character. Selim's conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517 was a masterstroke of strategic thinking. By capturing Egypt and Syria, the Ottomans gained control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the pilgrimage routes, and the immensely profitable spice trade between Asia and Europe. More importantly, the Mamluk Caliph transferred the title of Caliph, leader of all Muslims, to Selim. Overnight, the Ottomans became not just another empire, but the protectors of Islam itself. But it was under Selim's son, Suleiman, that the Ottoman Empire reached its golden age. Europeans called him the Magnificent, but his own people knew him as Kanuni, the lawgiver. Suleiman was that rarest of rulers, a man who was equally gifted as a military commander, administrator, and patron of the arts. Under his rule, the Ottoman legal system was codified in the Kanuni Osmani, creating a unified system of justice that balanced Islamic law with practical governance. The empire's cultural flowering under Suleiman was extraordinary. The architect Sinan built mosques that rivaled the greatest achievements of Byzantine architecture. Poets like Baki created works that are still considered masterpieces of Turkish literature. The decorative arts reached new heights with Iznik tiles and intricate calligraphy, but Suleiman was also a conqueror. His armies pushed deep into Europe, reaching the gates of Vienna in 1529. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like all of Christian Europe might fall to Ottoman power. The siege of Vienna failed, but not because of Ottoman weakness. The empire had simply reached its natural limits, the point where the costs of expansion outweighed the benefits. Suleiman was wise enough to recognize this and consolidate rather than overextend. By the time of Suleiman's death in 1566, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean, from the Crimean steppes to the deserts of Yemen. It was the largest empire the world had seen since Rome, and arguably more diverse and sophisticated than any empire before or since. The Ottomans had achieved something remarkable. They had created a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that provided stability, prosperity, and opportunity for millions of people across 3 continents. The question was, could they maintain it? What made the Ottoman Empire work wasn't just military might. It was an incredibly sophisticated system of governance that balanced central control with local autonomy, religious devotion with practical politics. At the heart of Ottoman administration was the devshirme system we touched on earlier. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through Christian communities in the Balkans, selecting the brightest boys to be trained for imperial service. These boys would be converted to Islam and educated in everything from military tactics to poetry, mathematics to statecraft. This system produced some of the most capable administrators in history. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha was born a Serbian Christian. The famous architect Sinan started life as a Greek Orthodox boy from Anatolia. The system was undoubtedly harsh, but it created unprecedented social mobility and gave the empire access to talent from all corners of its territory. Perhaps even more remarkable was the millet system, the Ottoman approach to governing their incredibly diverse population. Rather than forcing religious uniformity, the Ottomans organized their subjects into semi-autonomous religious communities called millets. The Greek Orthodox millet was led by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who had authority over all Orthodox Christians in the empire. Jews had their own chief rabbi. Armenians had their patriarch. Each millet collected its own taxes, maintained its own courts for personal status matters, and preserved its own cultural traditions. This wasn't just tolerance, it was practical governance. The Ottomans understood that forcing religious conversion would create instability and rebellion. Instead, they created a system where diversity was not just accepted, but institutionalized. The Ottoman economy was built on the Taimar system, a form of land tenure where military officers were granted the right to collect taxes from specific territories in exchange for military service. This created a decentralized but effective system of tax collection and military recruitment. But the empire's wealth really came from trade. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and the Ottomans carefully regulated and taxed the flow of goods between East and West. Silk from Persia, spices from India, silver from the New World, all of it flowed through Ottoman territory. The influx of New World silver in the 1550s initially seemed like a blessing, but it would eventually contribute to the empire's economic problems through inflation. Still, for centuries, the Ottoman Empire was one of the wealthiest and most economically sophisticated states in the world. Religiously, the Ottomans maintained a careful balance. Sunni Islam was the state religion, and the Sultan was both political ruler and, after 1517, Caliph of all Muslims. But the empire also embraced Sufi orders, particularly the Bektashi order that was closely associated with the Janissaries. This religious flexibility extended to governance. While Islamic law, Sharia, governed personal status and religious matters, the Sultan's secular law, Qanun, regulated everything else. This dual system allowed the empire to maintain religious legitimacy while adapting to practical governance needs. The result was what historians call the Pax Ottomana, the Ottoman peace. For centuries, Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, Christians in the Balkans, Muslims in Central Asia, and countless others found protection and opportunity under Ottoman rule. It wasn't perfect, no system ever is. But for its time, the Ottoman Empire created a remarkably stable, prosperous, and tolerant society that governed one of the most diverse populations in human history. If you want to understand the true greatness of the Ottoman Empire, don't just look at their armies or their territories, look at their architecture, their art, their poetry, and their daily life. Because the Ottomans didn't just conquer, they created a civilization. The greatest symbol of Ottoman achievement might be the Suleimaniye Mosque in Istanbul, designed by the legendary architect Sinan. Sinan wasn't just any architect. He was a master who designed over 300 structures during his 50-year career, each one a testament to Ottoman engineering and aesthetic sophistication. The Suleimaniye isn't just beautiful, it's a marvel of engineering. Its dome seems to float weightlessly above the prayer hall, supported by a complex system of half-domes and buttresses that Sinan perfected through decades of experimentation. The acoustics are so perfect that a whisper from the mihrab can be heard clearly throughout the mosque. But Sinan's masterpiece was the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, completed when he was over 80 years old. With its soaring central dome and slender minarets, it represents the pinnacle of Ottoman architectural achievement and arguably surpasses even the Hagia Sophia that inspired it. These weren't just religious buildings. They were statements of power, demonstrations of Ottoman capability, and symbols of an empire at its cultural zenith. Ottoman art reached extraordinary heights during this period. Miniature painting developed its own distinctive style, blending Persian, Arab, and Turkish traditions into something uniquely Ottoman. These weren't just decorative, they were historical documents, recording everything from military campaigns to court ceremonies with remarkable detail. The famous Iznik tiles that decorated Ottoman palaces and mosques represented the pinnacle of ceramic art. The brilliant blues, greens, and whites, combined with intricate floral and geometric patterns, created an aesthetic that was immediately recognizable as Ottoman. Calligraphy was perhaps the most revered art form. Ottoman calligraphers developed new styles that were both beautiful and highly functional. The imperial monogram, or tugra, became one of the most recognizable symbols of Ottoman power. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Ottoman cultural life was how it permeated everyday existence. The coffee house, introduced to the empire in the 16th century, became the center of Ottoman intellectual life. These weren't just places to drink coffee. They were forums for debate, centers of news and gossip, and venues for poetry readings and musical performances. The Ottoman elite developed a fascinating obsession with tulips in the early 18th century, importing new varieties from Holland and creating elaborate tulip gardens. This tulip period represented a shift toward European influences and a more peaceful, aesthetic approach to power. Music flourished under Ottoman patronage. The classical Ottoman musical tradition, with its complex modal system and sophisticated compositions, influenced musical development from the Balkans to the Arab world. Even Ottoman cuisine became an art form. The imperial kitchens of Topkapi Palace employed hundreds of cooks specializing in different types of dishes. The Ottomans didn't just bring us coffee, they gave us baklava, doner kebab, Turkish delight, and countless other foods that are now enjoyed worldwide. The Ottomans were also serious about science and learning. Taqi al-Din established an observatory in Istanbul in the 1570s that rivaled those of Tycho Brahe in Europe. Ottoman physicians made significant advances in surgery and pharmacology. The empire's madrasas produced scholars who contributed to mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. It's true that the Ottomans were initially suspicious of the printing press, not allowing Arabic script printing until 1727. But this wasn't just religious conservatism, it was also economic protectionism for the large class of scribes and calligraphers who would have been displaced by printing. What made Ottoman culture so remarkable was its ability to synthesize influences from across their vast empire while maintaining a distinctive identity. Byzantine architectural techniques, Persian poetic forms, Arab calligraphy, Turkic musical traditions, all of these were absorbed and transformed into something recognizably Ottoman. This cultural synthesis wasn't just artistic, it was a form of soft power that helped hold the empire together. A provincial governor in Damascus, a merchant in Sarajevo, and a scholar in Cairo all participated in a shared Ottoman cultural universe that transcended ethnic and religious boundaries. The Ottoman Golden Age proved that the greatest empires aren't just military and political achievements, they're cultural ones. They create new ways of living, thinking, and creating that outlast any individual ruler or dynasty. But every Golden Age faces challenges, and by the 17th century, the very success of Ottoman civilization was beginning to create the seeds of its own stagnation. Every empire faces a moment of truth, when the systems that once made it strong become sources of weakness. For the Ottomans, that moment came gradually in the 17th century, as internal decay combined with external pressure to create what historians call the empire's long decline. The problem started at the very top. After Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire faced what we might call the succession problem. To prevent civil wars between princes, the Ottomans developed a system called the cage. Potential heirs were confined to the palace, cut off from military and administrative experience. The result was a series of sultans who were either children, mentally unstable, or completely unprepared for leadership. Ibrahim I was so erratic that he was eventually strangled by his own ministers. Mehmed IV was more interested in hunting than governing. The empire that had once been led by warrior sultans like Mehmed the Conqueror was now ruled by palace prisoners who had never seen a battlefield. This created a power vacuum that was filled by court factions, powerful viziers, and increasingly autonomous provincial governors. The central authority that had once held the empire together began to fragment. Remember those elite Janissary soldiers who had once been the empire's greatest military asset? By the 17th century, they had become its biggest liability. The Janissaries had evolved from disciplined professional soldiers into a hereditary military caste that was more interested in politics and profit than fighting. They began to marry, engage in trade, and pass their positions to their sons, all violations of their original purpose. Worse, they became kingmakers who could make or break sultans. In 1622, they actually murdered Sultan Osman II when he tried to reform their core. The Janissaries were supposed to be the empire's strength, but they had become a state within a state, more concerned with preserving their privileges than defending the empire. The military consequences of this internal decay became clear at the walls of Vienna in 1683. The Ottoman army, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, seemed poised to finally capture the city that had eluded Suleiman the Magnificent 150 years earlier. But the siege was a disaster. Poor planning, inadequate supplies, and lack of coordination led to a devastating defeat when a Polish led relief force arrived. The defeat at Vienna wasn't just a military loss, it was a psychological shock that shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. The consequences came quickly. In 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz forced the Ottomans to cede Hungary and Transylvania to Austria, Podolia to Poland, and the Morea to Venice. For the first time in their history, the Ottomans were forced to sign a treaty as the losing side. The empire's economic foundations were also crumbling. The influx of New World silver had caused massive inflation throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Ottoman goods became expensive compared to European alternatives, and the empire began losing its dominance of east-west trade. European merchants were also discovering new sea routes to Asia that bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. The Cape route around Africa and later the development of trade with the Americas meant that the Ottomans were no longer the essential middlemen between Europe and Asia. The tax farming system that had once provided stable revenue became increasingly corrupt and inefficient. Provincial tax farmers squeezed peasants harder, leading to rural uprisings and economic stagnation. Perhaps most damaging was the empire's growing technological gap with Europe. While European armies were adopting new firearms, artillery, and military techniques, the Ottomans clung to traditional methods. The printing press ban until 1727 symbolized a broader resistance to change. While Europe was experiencing the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, the Ottoman Empire was becoming increasingly inward-looking and conservative. This wasn't just about military technology. European ships were becoming faster and more maneuverable. European manufacturing was becoming more efficient. European agriculture was becoming more productive. In every area of technology and innovation, the Ottomans were falling behind. The empire's religious establishment also became increasingly rigid and conservative. The ulema, religious scholars, who had once been supporters of legal and administrative innovation, became opponents of any change that might threaten their authority. Sufi orders that had once provided flexibility and mystical spirituality became hidebound and politically reactionary. The empire that had once thrived on its ability to adapt and incorporate new ideas was becoming a prisoner of its own traditions. What had gone wrong? The Ottoman Empire had become a victim of its own success. The systems that had made it strong, the Janissary corps, the religious establishment, the administrative bureaucracy, had become entrenched interests more concerned with preserving their privileges than adapting to changing circumstances. The empire was still vast, still wealthy, still powerful, but it was no longer dynamic. It had lost the flexibility and adaptability that had made it great, and in a rapidly changing world, that loss of adaptability would prove fatal. The question facing the empire in 1700 was whether it could reform itself before it was too late. The answer would determine whether the Ottoman Empire would survive into the modern era or join the Romans, Byzantines, and other great empires in the dustbin of history. By the 19th century, Ottoman leaders faced a stark reality: reform or die. The empire that had once terrified Europe was now being called the sick man of Europe. But the Ottomans weren't going down without a fight. The most comprehensive attempt at modernization came with the Tanzimat, literally meaning reorganization. Beginning in 1839 under Sultan Abdulmejid I, these reforms aimed to transform the empire from a traditional Islamic state into something resembling a modern European nation. The changes were revolutionary. The Tanzimat established equality before the law for all subjects regardless of religion, created modern secular schools alongside traditional madrasas, built telegraph lines and railways, and established new commercial and criminal courts based on European models rather than Islamic law alone. The famous Galata Bridge in Istanbul became a symbol of this transformation. Spanning the Golden Horn, it connected the old Ottoman world with the new European-influenced districts of Beyoğlu and Galata. These weren't just cosmetic changes. The Ottomans were trying to create a new kind of imperial identity, one that could hold together Muslims, Christians, and Jews not through the old millet system, but through shared Ottoman citizenship. But reform created as many problems as it solved. Traditional religious authorities saw the secular reforms as a tax on Islam itself. Provincial governors resented the loss of their traditional autonomy, And most dangerously, the empire's various ethnic groups began to see themselves not as Ottomans, but as Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbs, and Arabs. European ideas about nationalism were poison to multi-ethnic empires. Why should Greek Orthodox Christians think of themselves as Ottomans when they could dream of an independent Greece? Why should Arabs remain loyal to a Turkish sultan when they could imagine their own Arab state? The empire that had once thrived on diversity was being torn apart by the very concept of national identity that was transforming Europe. By the early 20th century, a new generation of Ottoman reformers had concluded that the problem wasn't the reforms, it was that they hadn't gone far enough. The Committee of Union and Progress, known as the Young Turks, staged a revolution in 1908 that forced Sultan Abdulhamid II to restore the constitution and parliament he had suspended in 1878. The Young Turks were true revolutionaries. They wanted to create a modern, secular, centralized nation-state, out with the old millet system and provincial autonomy, in with Turkish nationalism, modern education, and European-style government. Their slogan was Union and Progress, but their methods were increasingly authoritarian. They suppressed political opposition, promoted Turkish culture at the expense of other languages and traditions, and gradually abandoned the multi-ethnic Ottoman identity for an exclusively Turkish one. The darkest chapter of the Young Turk period was the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1916. Faced with military disasters in World War I and convinced that Armenians were collaborating with Russia, the government ordered the mass deportation of Armenians from eastern Anatolia. What followed was systematic killing on an unprecedented scale. Historians estimate that between 800,000 and 1.5 million Armenians died through executions, forced marches, and starvation. It was one of the first genocides of the modern era and remains a source of international controversy to this day. The Armenian genocide revealed how far the empire had fallen from its earlier ideals of tolerance and inclusion. The Young Turks had become so desperate to preserve Ottoman power that they were willing to destroy the very diversity that had once been the empire's strength. The Young Turks' final attempt to save the empire was their decision to enter World War I on the side of Germany in 1914. The logic seemed sound. If Germany won, the Ottomans could regain their lost territories and restore their great power status. But it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The empire simply didn't have the resources to fight a modern war on multiple fronts. While the Ottomans achieved some notable victories, particularly at Gallipoli, where a young officer named Mustafa Kemal earned fame for his defense against British and Anzac forces, they were ultimately overwhelmed. The Arab Revolt, encouraged by British agent T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, stripped away the empire's Middle Eastern provinces. Russian advances in the Caucasus were devastating. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was completely defeated and occupied by Allied forces. Why did these reform efforts ultimately fail? The fundamental problem was timing. The Ottomans were trying to modernize at the same time that European nationalism was making multi-ethnic empires obsolete. They were attempting to create Ottoman patriotism in an age when people were being taught to think in terms of ethnic and religious identity. Moreover, every reform created new constituencies that demanded even more change, while simultaneously alienating traditional supporters. The empire found itself caught between conservative Muslims who saw reform as betrayal and liberal nationalists who saw the empire itself as obsolete. The tragedy is that many of these reforms were genuinely progressive. Ottoman women gained new rights, religious minorities achieved legal equality, modern education and technology were spreading throughout the empire. But progress wasn't enough to save an empire that had outlived its time. The question now was whether anything would rise from the ashes of 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. When the guns fell silent on the Western Front in November 1918, the Ottoman Empire was finished, not just defeated, utterly broken. Allied forces occupied Istanbul, British and French troops controlled the Middle East, and Greek armies were landing on the Anatolian coast with dreams of recreating the Byzantine Empire. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 was meant to be the Ottoman Empire's death certificate. It stripped away all Arab territories, gave eastern Anatolia to an independent Armenia, granted autonomy to the Kurds, and left the Turks with just a small rump state around Ankara. The Straits would be internationalized, and the great city of Istanbul itself would remain under Allied occupation. It seemed like the end of Turkish power forever. European diplomats were already dividing up the Ottoman inheritance through secret agreements like Sykes-Picot, which carved up the Middle East between British and French spheres of influence. But they had miscalculated. They had forgotten that the Ottoman Empire's greatest strength had always been its ability to adapt and survive. Enter Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, who landed in the Black Sea port of Samsun in May 1919, with a mission that would have seemed impossible: to forge a new nation from the ruins of a dying empire. Kemal understood something that the Ottoman reformers had missed. You couldn't save the Ottoman Empire, but you could create something new from its ashes. Instead of trying to hold together a multi-ethnic empire, he would build a modern Turkish nation-state. The Turkish War of Independence wasn't just a military campaign, it was a revolution. Kemal and his supporters fought simultaneously against Greek invaders, Armenian forces, French occupiers, British-backed Ottoman loyalists, and Kurdish rebels. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated diplomatically, but they had something their enemies lacked: the desperate energy of people fighting for their survival. At the Battle of Sakarya in 1921, Kemal's forces held off a Greek offensive that came within 50 miles of Ankara. The next year, they launched the Great Offensive that drove Greek forces into the sea at Smyrna. On November 1st, 1922, the Turkish Grand National Assembly took a step that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. They abolished the Sultanate. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan, fled Istanbul on a British warship, ending over 600 years of Ottoman rule. The Caliphate lasted until 1924, when it too was abolished. The man who had once been considered the spiritual leader of all Muslims was sent into exile, and Turkey declared itself a secular republic. This wasn't just political change, it was cultural revolution. Kemal, who took the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks, banned the fez and turban, introduced the Latin alphabet, gave women the vote, and outlawed polygamy. In less than a decade, he transformed Turkey from an Islamic empire into a European-style nation-state. But what happened to the rest of the Ottoman Empire? The answer shaped the modern Middle East, Balkans, and North Africa in ways we're still living with today. In the Arab world, the collapse of Ottoman rule didn't lead to the unified Arab state that nationalists had dreamed of. Instead, European powers carved the region into artificial countries with borders drawn by colonial administrators who often had never set foot in the territories they were dividing. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine — these weren't ancient nations recovering their independence. They were new creations, often combining peoples who had little in common except their former Ottoman citizenship. The problems this created persist today: the ongoing conflicts in Syria and Iraq, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, the Lebanese civil war. All of these can be traced back to the hasty and often arbitrary way the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. But the Ottoman legacy goes far beyond political boundaries. Across the former empire, you can still see, taste, and hear Ottoman influence everywhere. Walk through the old city of Sarajevo, and the Ottoman architecture is unmistakable. Visit a coffee house in Damascus, and you're participating in a tradition that began in Ottoman Istanbul. Eat doner kebab in Berlin, or baklava in New York, and you're enjoying Ottoman cuisine. The Turkish language contains thousands of Arabic and Persian words absorbed during the Ottoman centuries. Albanian, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Arabic all have Turkish loanwords. The call to prayer still echoes from Ottoman-era mosques, from Bosnia to Yemen. In recent decades, there's been a revival of interest in the Ottoman past, particularly in Turkey under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This neo-Ottomanism sees the Ottoman Empire not as a relic of the past, but as a model for Turkish influence in the former Ottoman lands. Turkey has built mosques in Bosnia, provided aid during the Arab Spring, and positioned itself as a leader of the Muslim world. Whether this represents genuine Ottoman influence or simply Turkish nationalism dressed in historical costume remains a matter of debate. So what can we learn from the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire? Perhaps this: that adaptability is both the key to success and the hardest thing to maintain. The Ottomans succeeded for over 600 years because they were masters of adaptation. They absorbed the best of Byzantine, Persian, Arab, and European civilizations. They created institutions that balanced competing interests and managed diversity better than any empire before or since. But when the world changed faster than they could adapt, when nationalism replaced religion as the primary source of identity, when industrial technology revolutionized warfare, when European capitalism transformed the global economy. Their very flexibility became a weakness. The Ottoman Empire reminds us that no power, no matter how great, lasts forever. But it also shows us that the greatest achievements of any civilization aren't its conquests or its wealth. They're the institutions, ideas, and cultural innovations that outlive the empire itself. 623 years. That's how long the Ottoman Empire lasted. Longer than Rome, longer than the British Empire, longer than any other Islamic empire in history. From Osman's dream of a tree spanning continents to Mehmed VI's lonely exile on a British warship, the Ottomans created one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Think about what they achieved. They built an empire that stretched across 3 continents and governed more diverse populations than any state before the modern era. They created institutions that balanced central authority with local autonomy, religious devotion with practical governance. They produced architectural marvels that still take our breath away, fostered arts and sciences that influenced the world, and created a cosmopolitan culture that celebrated diversity rather than feared it. But perhaps their greatest achievement was simply this. They proved that different peoples, different faiths, and different cultures could not only coexist, but thrive together. The Pax Ottomana, the Ottoman peace, provided stability and prosperity for millions of people across centuries of human history. Their downfall teaches us equally important lessons. The Ottomans fell not because they were weak, but because they couldn't adapt fast enough to a rapidly changing world. The flexibility that had been their greatest strength became their weakness when faced with the twin challenges of European nationalism and industrial revolution. They tried to reform, God knows they tried. The Tanzimat reforms, the Young Turk Revolution, the desperate modernization efforts of the early 20th century, all of these showed that Ottoman leaders understood the need for change. But by then, it was too late. The world had moved beyond multi-ethnic empires to an age of nation-states. The tragedy is that in many ways, the Ottoman model of diversity and tolerance was ahead of its time. In our globalized 21st century, when we're struggling with questions of multiculturalism, religious pluralism, and how to govern diverse societies, we could learn a lot from how the Ottomans managed these challenges for over 6 centuries. Today, as we watch the ongoing conflicts in Syria, Iraq, the Balkans, and other former Ottoman territories, it's worth remembering that these regions once knew centuries of relative peace and stability. The arbitrary borders drawn by European colonial powers after World War I created many of the problems that persist today. The Ottoman story is ultimately about the rise and fall of civilizations, how they're built, what sustains them, and why they eventually crumble. It's about the eternal tension between tradition and change, between unity and diversity, between the dream of lasting forever and the reality that nothing does. But here's what the Ottomans would want us to remember. Empires end, but ideas endure. The Ottoman commitment to religious tolerance, cultural synthesis, and adaptive governance influenced the development of the modern world in countless ways. From the coffee you drink in the morning to the architectural styles that surround you, from concepts of religious freedom to models of multicultural society, the Ottoman legacy lives on. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, climate change, technological disruption, cultural conflicts, economic inequality, the Ottoman example offers both hope and warning. Hope, because it shows that seemingly impossible challenges can be overcome through adaptation, tolerance, and innovative thinking. Warning, because it demonstrates that even the most successful civilizations can fall if they fail to keep pace with change. The Ottoman Empire lasted 623 years, not because it was perfect, but because it was adaptable. When it stopped adapting, it died. That's a lesson worth remembering in our own rapidly changing world. So what empire should we explore next? The Mongols, who created the largest contiguous land empire in history. The British, whose naval power shaped the modern world. The Romans, whose legal and political innovations still influence us today. Let me know in the comments below. Because if the Ottomans taught us anything, it's this. Understanding the past is the key to navigating the future. And in a world where change is the only constant, we need all the historical wisdom we can get. The Ottomans remind us that no power lasts forever, but the best of what they created can inspire us still.